My son called me at 2:07 in the morning. His voice was tight, shaking. He said he needed $200,000. Right now. He told me his wife was supposedly in a hospital in Dallas and that the doctors would not touch her without a deposit. For a moment in that dark and quiet hour, I was not a retired widower in Plano. I was just a father, standing barefoot on cold hardwood, ready to give everything I had. Then I heard her behind him, not crying, not weak, whispering instructions, telling him exactly what to say, like I was a switch she could flip. And that was when something in me stopped. He could not name a doctor. He could not name a nurse. He could not even tell me which floor she was on. That was when I realized this was not panic. It was a script. Hanging up felt like betraying my son. Until the phone rang again the next morning. This time, a detective from Dallas Financial Crimes was on the line. He told me I had done the right thing. He told me my family was showing up inside a pattern they had been tracking for years. A pattern where older men like me did not just lose money. They lost control of their own lives. In that moment, I understood the call at 2 in the morning was not the beginning. It was a test. And if I failed, the next step would not be a request. It would be paperwork, signatures, courtrooms, someone else deciding what I was still allowed to do with my own name. My name is Daniel Whitaker. I am 67 years old, retired, widowed, and I thought the quiet I earned was safe. Until the phone rang and taught me how easily love can be turned into leverage. For a long time before that night, I believed silence was something a man could trust. I used to believe the phone did not ring in the middle of the night, unless it truly mattered. That belief made the quiet easier to live with. Plano, Texas settles into itself after dark. Streets go still. Porch lights glow without asking for attention. A man can convince himself that nothing urgent will find him here. I am 67 years old, retired, widowed. My days have slowed into habits that do not require much thought. Coffee before sunrise, a walk around the block after dinner, the television off more often than on. Silence that feels earned. Since Margaret died, the house has learned how to hold only one person. One plate in the sink, one mug on the counter, one set of keys in the bowl by the door. I keep my phone face down on the nightstand because sleep comes easier when the world cannot reach me. I keep the ringer on anyway. Family is the reason. Family for me has narrowed to 2 people, my son Lucas and his wife Madeline. Lucas is 39, old enough that I should hear a grown man when he speaks. Sometimes I still hear the boy. Madeline is 36, sharp and composed, the kind of woman who can make a suggestion sound final. I noticed that years ago and told myself it was not my place to interfere. The phone lit up at 2:07 in the morning. Lucas. The glow cut through the dark and pulled me awake all at once. For a heartbeat, I expected to hear Margaret shift beside me, the way she used to, already worried before I even answered. That reflex has not left me yet. I picked up on the first ring. Lucas. What is wrong? His breathing was fast, too fast, like he had been moving. Dad, you need to listen to me, please. Please is a heavy word when it comes from your own son. It carries every year you spent trying to be steady for him. What happened? Are you hurt? No. It is Madeline. We are at the hospital. The word hospital snapped the rest of the sleep out of me. I sat up and let my feet find the cold floor. My mind reached for memories I did not want. Fluorescent lights, antiseptic, Waiting rooms that never feel warm enough. Which hospital? There was a pause. Not long. Just long enough to notice. Texas Health Presbyterian, Dallas. The name made sense. I had been there once years ago to visit a friend after surgery. I could picture the entrance and the parking structure. That detail lowered my guard for a moment. Dad, I need $200,000 right now. The number landed hard. Not 10, not 20. 200,000. My mouth went dry. I stood without realizing it and stared at the far wall as if it might explain what I had just heard. 200,000. Lucas, tell me what is going on. His words rushed out. Complications. Something unexpected. A procedure they had to do soon. Insurance problems. A deposit required before they could move forward. As he spoke, I heard something else. Not fear, not pain. A whisper close to the phone. Tell him it is urgent. Say they will not start without it. It was flat and controlled. Lucas inhaled and repeated the idea almost exactly. Urgent. They will not start without it. Fear makes people talk fast. Panic makes them forget details. Panic does not usually come with a second voice directing the conversation. Lucas, slow down. Put a nurse on the phone. Another pause. Longer this time. I heard a faint rustle like he turned his head. Then the whisper again, sharper than before. No. Do not do that. Just get it from him. Something cold slid in beneath my worry. Over the years, I learned a simple rule. True stories survive simple questions. False ones do not. I asked for the doctor name, the department, a billing number, anything I could verify. I told him I would pay the hospital directly. Dad, I do not know. They just told me. They are moving her. There was no hospital noise behind him. No overhead voice, no beeping. Just his breathing and that whisper that never sounded afraid. Tell him you are outside the operating room. Tell him she could die. Lucas swallowed and said it as if it had been placed in his mouth. I am outside the operating room. She could die. That line was meant to end the conversation. It was meant to stop thinking and start obedience. I walked to the window and pulled the curtain back an inch. The street was empty. A parked truck, a few porch lights. The world asleep while my son tried to pull $200,000 out of my life in the dark. I had written checks larger than this before, signed papers that moved real money, but never like this. Never without a single name. Never without something solid to hold on to. Lucas, I am not saying no. I am saying I need facts. Call me back in 5 minutes with the doctor name and the nurse station number. He did not answer right away. The whisper returned harder now. If he stalls, we lose. Tell him you will never forgive him. Lucas' breathing turned ragged. Dad, if you do not do this and something happens to her, I do not know if I can forgive you. That one reached deep. It aimed for my guilt. The part of me that still tried to live up to Margaret memory. The part that believed a father should take the hit so his child does not have to. I looked at my hand in the dim light. Veins raised, fingers stiff with age. These were the hands that lifted Lucas onto my shoulders. The hands that signed as his co-signer when he needed help. The hands that held my wife as she faded. I did not raise my son to threaten me. Or maybe I raised him to be loyal to the wrong person. Lucas, I love you. I always will. But I am not sending $200,000 because someone is feeding you lines. Silence. Then Lucas came back sharp. "No one is feeding me anything. You are imagining things." And right after that, the whisper softer, now almost bored. "Hang up. He is not going to do it." Lucas exhaled hard. "Fine, Dad. Fine. I will handle it myself." The call ended. I stood there with the phone against my ear, listening to nothing. The house felt colder, as if the air had stepped back. I set the phone on the counter and poured a glass of water. My hand shook and spilled some. I left it there. I wanted to call him back, to drive to Dallas and look him in the eye, to pull him back to shore if he was drowning. Instead, I sat at the kitchen table in the dark, with the streetlight painting a pale rectangle on the floor, and stared at my silent phone. If I was wrong, my son would never forgive me. If I was right, then someone in my own family had just tried to use my love like a key. And when morning came, I would have to face my son and live with whatever truth was waiting in the light. Morning came without rest. I moved through the house like a man who had already been awake too long, even though the clock said otherwise. I rinsed a coffee mug I had not finished and set it upside down in the rack. I straightened a chair that did not need it. My phone stayed in my hand screen, dark, heavier than it should have been. The sun was just high enough to spill light across the kitchen floor when it rang again. An unfamiliar number. Local. I let it ring once, maybe twice. Long enough to decide whether I was ready to hear whatever came next. I answered. The voice on the other end was calm in a way that did not ask for trust. It assumed it. "Mr. Whitaker, this is Detective Aaron Cole with the Dallas Police Department. Financial crimes." My back went straight. The room seemed to sharpen around me. He gave me a badge number and a callback line without being asked. He did not rush. He did not soften his words either. "We were alerted to a suspicious call placed early this morning. I need to confirm that I am speaking with Daniel Whitaker, 67, residing in Plano." "Yes," I said. There was a brief pause, then he said something I did not expect to hear. "You did the right thing by not sending money." The certainty in his voice landed harder than comfort ever could. It meant he was not guessing. I asked him what this was about. He did not tell a story. He outlined a pattern. His unit had been tracking financial exploitation cases involving older adults in the Dallas and Plano area. The approach was familiar. A sudden crisis. A hospital emergency. Pressure applied at night. Large sums demanded before questions could be asked. He said it plainly. The person making the call is rarely acting alone. I leaned against the counter and stared at the window above the sink. "Why me?" I asked. "Because the names involved overlap with an ongoing investigation," he said, "and because your situation showed signs of escalation." I felt something cold settle in my chest. Escalation meant planning. It meant repetition. I told him about the call, about Lucas saying Madeline was at Texas Health Presbyterian Dallas, about the $200,000, about the urgency. When I mentioned the second voice, he did not interrupt. "Tell me about it," he said when I finished. I described it the only way I could. Controlled. Close to the phone. Not afraid. Feeding lines. Ending the conversation whenever I asked for details. When I stopped talking, there was a silence on the other end that did not feel empty. "Mr. Whitaker," he said, "I want you to hear me clearly. Do not send any money. Do not wire funds. Do not hand over cash. Do not sign anything that comes to your door. If you are presented with documents, you take photos and you call me." Each instruction carried weight, the kind that comes from experience, I asked the question that had been pressing against my ribs since he said escalation. Are you saying my son is involved in a crime? He answered carefully. We are investigating activity connected to his household. In cases like this, sometimes the adult child is pressured by a spouse. Sometimes the adult child participates. Sometimes they do both. We do not know where your son falls yet. I closed my eyes. Lucas at 10 with grass stains on his knees. Lucas at 18 asking if he could call me from college more often. Lucas standing beside Madeline at their wedding, nervous but proud. Those images did not disappear just because a detective said household. I asked if Lucas had called the police. Detective Cole paused before answering. We were alerted through call pattern analysis and related reports. I cannot share all sources yet. What I can tell you is that your situation did not begin at 2 in the morning. That call was one link in a longer chain. That sentence stayed with me. Longer chain. He asked me to meet him in person. A public place in Plano where people came and went. Late morning, somewhere safe. He told me not to confront my son yet. Not to accuse, not to mention the police. People get unpredictable when they believe their plan is exposed. Plan. After we ended the call, the house felt different. Not unfamiliar. Exposed. I set my phone face up on the table and sat across from it, as if watching an animal that might move on its own. The quiet was no longer peaceful. It felt like a held breath. My eyes drifted to a folder on the counter. Old paperwork I had pulled out months ago and never put away. Inside was a copy of a form I had signed for Lucas. Just a quick thing. Just a favor. He had said it would make life easier. I took it out and studied the signature at the bottom. My name. My handwriting. I remembered signing it without reading every line. Remembered Madeline standing nearby, saying she would handle the details. At the time, it felt like trust. Now it felt like an opening. The phone stayed silent. No message from Lucas. No apology. No explanation. I thought about what Detective Cole had said. If there was a pattern, someone had practiced. If someone had practiced, then this had not started with a desperate call in the dark. It had started with small permissions. With moments I had waved off because they did not feel dangerous. I folded the paper and slid it back into the folder. My hands were steady, but my stomach was not. Whatever was coming next was bigger than a family argument, bigger than a misunderstanding that could be talked through over coffee. I sat there in the quiet house and realized something I had never considered before. If the police knew what was happening before I did, then I was already behind. And if I was already behind, then the next move would matter more than any I had made so far. That thought followed me through the next few days like a shadow that did not care whether I turned toward it or away. I went to the meeting with Detective Cole. I listened. I nodded. I did what he asked. But when I came back to my house when the door closed and the quiet returned, my mind did not stay in the present. It drifted backward to places I had avoided visiting for years. It always came back to 2016. The year Margaret died. Cancer does not arrive loudly. It moves in slowly, politely at first, then with purpose. By the time we understood what we were facing, the decisions were already being made for us. Hospital rooms, treatment schedules, paperwork that kept multiplying. Margaret handled most of it herself until she could not. I was there, but I was tired, scared, and grateful whenever someone else offered to help. Lucas was devastated. He took time off work. He stayed at the house more often. He slept on the couch some nights because he said it felt wrong to leave me alone. Madeline stepped in without being asked. She brought meals. She organized medications. She offered to sort through mail so we would not miss anything important. At the time, it felt like kindness. At the funeral, I remember standing beside the casket and feeling like I was watching my life from a distance. People came up to me, said the right things, squeezed my hand. Lucas stayed close. Madeline stood just behind him, her hand on his back. It was after the service, when the crowd thinned, that she asked her first question. She spoke softly, respectful, like she was afraid of intruding. She wanted to know if the life insurance paperwork had already been filed or if that was something she could help with. She said it would be easier if everything was handled promptly, less stress for Lucas later. I remember nodding. I remember thinking it was practical. A few weeks later, she asked about the house. Not about selling it, just about whether the deed was updated, whether everything was clear, in case something happened to me too. She framed it as concern. Lucas had already lost one parent. It would be terrible if there were complications later. I signed papers without reading every word. I had done that my whole life. Trusted professionals, trusted family, trusted that people around me wanted what was best. The requests were never big. They came in pieces. Lucas asked if I could co-sign something for him just temporarily, until a refinance went through. He said Madeline had already checked with the bank and it was routine. I signed. Madeline suggested that my bank statements be sent to their address instead of mine, just so they could help keep an eye on things. She said older people were often targeted by scams. She said it was safer that way. I agreed. There was a day she offered to help me set up online access to my accounts. I had never bothered with that. She said it would make paying bills easier, and she could show me how. I sat at the table while she typed. I did not watch her hands as closely as I should have. None of it felt wrong in the moment. That is the dangerous part. If someone had asked me for $200,000 in 2016, I would have laughed. If someone had demanded control outright, I would have shut it down. But no one did that. They asked for small things, reasonable things, things that sounded like help. I told myself I was being generous, supportive, a good father. What I was really being was convenient. I walked through the house one afternoon and opened a drawer I had not touched in years. Inside were old folders stacked neatly labeled in my handwriting: insurance, property, taxes. I pulled them out and spread them across the dining table. As I flipped through the pages, memories surfaced with each signature, each date, each place where I had trusted someone else to handle the details. There were moments I remembered clearly. Madeline standing at the end of the table explaining why a particular form needed to be signed quickly. Lucas looking relieved when I did not ask questions. Me telling myself it was fine because they were family. I sat there for a long time staring at the paper. The realization did not come with anger. It came with something heavier. Responsibility. The signs had been there. Not flashing. Not screaming. Just quietly present, waiting for me to notice. I had not noticed because noticing would have meant changing how I saw my son, how I saw my place in his life. It was easier to believe I was helping than to consider I was being positioned. I thought back to the call at 2 a.m, the urgency, the pressure, the way guilt had been used like a switch. That moment had not come out of nowhere. It was built on years of small permissions. I closed the folders and stacked them again. For the first time since Margaret died, I stopped asking myself what Lucas and Madeline were doing. Instead, I asked a different question. What had I allowed to happen? And once I asked it, I knew there was no going back to the way things were before. That question followed me into the middle of the week, quiet but relentless. It did not come as panic. It showed up while I waited at traffic lights, while I stood in the grocery aisle deciding between two identical brands, while I folded a shirt I had already folded once. What had I allowed to happen was no longer something I asked myself in anger. It had become a fact that wanted to be examined. After my meeting with Detective Cole, I called my bank and asked to come in. I did not explain much over the phone. I did not need to. Cole had warned me not to leave a trail I did not control. He told me to do it in person. He told me not to tell Lucas or Madeline where I was going. That part sat wrong with me. A father should not feel like he needs permission to protect himself from his own family. By Thursday morning, not even a full week after the call in the dark, I drove to the branch I had used for years. Same brick building, same flag out front, same sense of order that banks are designed to project. I parked, sat for a moment with the engine off, and reminded myself to breathe. Inside, the air smelled faintly of cleaner and paper. People waited in chairs with folders on their laps. A normal day. I asked for Rebecca Lawson by name. She came out from the back a minute later. Calm. Professional. She did not smile too much. She shook my hand and guided me into a small office with a glass wall. The door closed softly behind us. She did not waste time. She asked for my identification and verified details that only I should know. Address, employment history, recent deposits, questions meant to confirm that I was still in control of my own life. Each answer I gave felt heavier than the last. When she turned her screen so I could see it, my first thought was that nothing looked wrong. Rows of numbers, dates, notes, the kind of information people skim because it feels boring. Then she pointed to a line of credit, $85,000. Opened in late 2022. I felt my jaw tighten. I had never opened a line of credit I could not remember. I paid off my mortgage early. I did not borrow money casually. That is not mine, I said. Rebecca nodded once, like she had expected that answer. She scrolled. A mailing address change. Statements redirected to a post office box in Frisco. Frisco was close enough to be deliberate. Far enough that I would never stumble onto it by accident. I told her I had never requested that. She said she knew. Then she showed me the signature. It was not mine, but it tried to be. The shape was close. The rhythm of the letters familiar. Close enough to pass at a glance. Close enough to fool a system that wanted efficiency more than truth. I stared at it and felt something shift inside me. Not anger, recognition. I thought of Madeline at my kitchen table offering to help me set things up online. I thought of how often she had insisted on making things easier. I thought of how easily convenience turns into control. Rebecca pointed out 2 attempted transfers. Small amounts. Both blocked. Both flagged. Test runs, she said quietly. That word stayed with me. Test runs meant patience. Planning. Someone learning my boundaries. I asked her if this was connected to the call from Lucas. She did not answer directly. She slid a printed page across the desk. This is what concerns me most. The page was not about money. It was about authority. Rebecca explained it carefully. An inquiry connected to guardianship. Not filed through the bank, but related documentation often accompanies attempts to take control of an account when someone claims an older adult is no longer capable of managing their affairs. Emergency guardianship if someone argued there was immediate risk. Authority to sign. authority to manage finances, sometimes authority over medical decisions. I stared at the paper, my mind pushed back like refusing to accept the shape of a threat. I am not incompetent, I said. Rebecca met my eyes. I know. But petitions are sometimes written to suggest vulnerability, selective facts, omitted context. The goal is not to prove you are incapable. The goal is to create doubt. For the first time since the call, fear landed fully. Not the fear of losing money, the fear of losing the right to decide. I pictured sitting in a courtroom while someone else spoke for me. Pictured being told decisions had already been made. Pictured my son sitting quietly while his wife handled the details. Pictured my life becoming something managed. Lucas's face came into my mind then. Not as a suspect, as my child, as someone who could tell himself this was temporary, necessary, just paperwork. That thought hurt more than anything Rebecca had shown me. She told me what to do next. Freeze what I could. Review my credit reports. Speak to an attorney. Do not sign anything. Document everything. I nodded. I listened. I absorbed. Rebecca printed a summary and slid it into a manila envelope. She told me she would place alerts on my accounts and coordinate with Detective Cole if needed. She did not offer sympathy. She offered clarity. That was better. When I stood to leave, I caught a look in her eyes that I had not seen before. Pity, not for my finances, for what it costs a man to realize he is being targeted inside his own life. Outside, the sun was bright. Cars moved in and out of the lot. People laughed into their phones. Nothing looked different. I sat in my truck and rested the envelope on my lap. It felt heavier than paper should. I had walked into the bank as a father still wondering if he had overreacted. I walked out knowing that doubt was a luxury I no longer had. This was not about money. It was about control, about dignity, about whether I would be allowed to speak for myself in the months ahead. As I pulled out of the parking lot, one thought stayed with me. Someone had been building a case against me slowly and carefully, the way you build a trap. And now I could feel the pressure starting to close. The pressure did not disappear after that. It settled. It showed up in small ways. In the way I checked my phone before bed, and again when I woke up. In the way I listened for my truck in the driveway, as if someone else might have driven it during the night. Once you understand that a line has been crossed, you stop assuming anything is harmless. The next morning I sat in an office that smelled faintly of old books and black coffee. Samuel Trent did not look like a man who wasted words. Late 50s, gray at the temples, suit worn the way someone wears something functional, not symbolic. His office walls held framed degrees and no personal photos. It told me everything I needed to know. This was not a place for reassurance. He listened while I talked. About the call, about the bank, about the word guardianship. When I finished, he folded his hands on the desk and looked at me without sympathy. I am going to be direct, he said. That is usually better for everyone. I nodded. Texas law is designed to protect older adults from exploitation, he said. But the same laws can be used aggressively if someone prepares the paperwork well. Emergency guardianship exists for a reason. When it is abused, it moves fast. He explained it without drama. If a petition were filed, a judge could temporarily limit my ability to sign checks, to enter contracts, in some cases to make medical decisions, all before a full hearing, all before I ever had a chance to defend myself properly. I asked him if being mentally sound mattered. It matters eventually, he said. But the emergency phase is about risk, and risk is defined by whoever writes the story first. That sentence stayed with me. He told me what strengthened those petitions. Doctor notes taken out of context. Claims of confusion. Claims of financial mismanagement. Family members presenting themselves as concerned and responsible. Concern is easy to perform, he said. I thought of Madeline asking questions at the funeral, of how reasonable she always sounded, of how easily reason can be mistaken for care. Samuel asked if I had recent medical records, if I had a will, if I had designated power of attorney. I answered honestly. He nodded, already thinking ahead. Then he said something that surprised me. You are not alone in this. I looked up. He reached into a file and pulled out a summary. Names blacked out. Dates intact. Over the past 2 years, he said, I have seen at least 4 cases with a similar structure. Men between 60 and 75, widowed or divorced, financially stable, adult children involved, a medical emergency used as leverage. He slid the paper toward me. The outcomes varied, he said. Some caught it early, some did not. I did not ask what happened to the ones who did not. After I left his office, I sat in my truck for a long time without starting the engine. The building across the street housed a dentist, a real estate office. Normal places, normal lives. It struck me how quiet legal threats can be. No sirens, no warnings, just paper and timing. That afternoon, Detective Cole called. His tone had not changed. Still steady, still precise. He told me they had confirmed additional cases. 4 men, different neighborhoods, same pattern. Late-night calls, medical stories, pressure, transfers attempted. In 2 cases, guardianship paperwork had been prepared but not finalized. Were any of them related, I asked. He said no. Different families, different names, same playbook. I felt something hard settle into place. This was not chaos. It was repetition. Someone refining a method. I asked him if Lucas was considered a suspect. We are still determining roles, he said. What I can tell you is that in several cases, the adult child believed they were helping, or believed they had no choice. That hurt in a way I had not expected. After the call, I sat alone in my living room. The afternoon light stretched across the carpet. The house looked the same. The furniture had not moved. But I was aware of it differently now, as if I were standing inside something that could be taken from me without warning. I thought about confronting Lucas, demanding answers, shouting until the truth fell out. Then I thought about what Samuel had said, about stories being written by whoever moved first, about how quickly things escalated when plans were threatened. I realized something uncomfortable. If I reacted emotionally, I would make their case easier. So I decided to do something that did not come naturally to me. I stayed quiet. I returned calls normally. I answered messages politely. I did not accuse. I did not reveal what I knew. I let things continue as they were on the surface. But underneath, I watched. I gathered documents. I followed instructions. I listened more than I spoke. I kept my own counsel. For most of my life, I believed that honesty and confrontation were the same thing. Say what you see. Say it clearly. Deal with it head on. This situation did not call for that. It called for patience. It called for letting the truth show itself without me pushing it into the open too soon. As evening came, my phone buzzed with a message from Lucas. Just checking in. Hope you are doing okay. I stared at it longer than I should have. I typed back a simple reply. I am fine. Talk soon. I set the phone down and leaned back in my chair. I was still in the game. But now I understood the rules, and I intended to stay in long enough to see who would make the next move. That night, I read Lucas's message again, then I read it a third time, like the words might change if I stared hard enough. Just checking in. Hope you are doing okay. It was the kind of text you send when you want to sound normal. It was also the kind of text you send when you want to see if the person on the other end is still under control. I replied with 2 sentences and nothing more. Then I set my phone down and waited. A few days passed. No more late-night calls, no frantic demands. The surface calmed, which only made me more certain that something underneath was still moving. Detective Cole checked in once. Brief, careful. He reminded me to keep things steady until they had enough to act. Samuel Trent told me the same in his own language. Do not give anyone a reason to speed up. So I stayed quiet. Quiet on the outside, but inside my mind kept returning to the same question. Where does my son end and my daughter-in-law begin? On Saturday morning, Lucas asked if we could meet. Just the 2 of us. He did not say why. He did not mention the hospital. He suggested a place near where he used to play Little League, a small diner off Preston Road that still served breakfast all day and still smelled like coffee and hot grease. I told him yes. I arrived early and chose a booth with my back to the wall. Old habit. The waitress poured coffee and called me honey the way Texas women do when they have seen enough life to know a man is carrying something. I stirred cream into the cup and watched the door. Lucas walked in 10 minutes later. He looked tired. Not the tired of a long week at work. The tired of a man who has been holding his breath for months. His shoulders were tense and his eyes kept scanning the room like he expected someone to be there. He slid into the booth across from me and tried to smile. It did not reach his eyes. Morning, Dad. Morning, I said. We sat with the menu between us like a shield. He picked it up, put it down, picked it up again. His hands were restless. I waited. A father learns when to speak and when silence will do the job better. Lucas finally looked at me. You have been quiet. So have you, I said. His jaw tightened. He looked away toward the window. Cars moved past. People with shopping bags. A normal Saturday. Dad, he said about the other night. I did not lean in. I did not soften my voice. I kept it steady. What about it? He swallowed. You did not help. You made it worse. There it was. The first defense, blame as a way to avoid truth. I let the words hang for a second. Then I asked him something simple. Was Madeline at Texas Health that night? His eyes flicked up, then down. He did not answer. Lucas. I said, did you see her in a hospital bed? His mouth opened, closed, then opened again. His voice came out smaller. No. The diner noise seemed to fade. I could still hear forks and the coffee machine, but my attention narrowed to my son. I kept my tone low. Then where were you? He rubbed his forehead like he was trying to wipe away the last few days. We were at home. She was on the couch. On the couch. I felt my chest tighten, but I did not let it show. Then why did you call me? His eyes watered, then he blinked it away fast. Pride. Shame. Something older than both. Because she told me to, he said. The words came out like a confession. I did not say I knew. I did not say a detective called me. I did not mention the bank. I watched him and waited for him to keep going. Lucas's voice turned rough. Dad, I did not want to. I swear to God I did not want to. But she was losing it. She said we were out of options. Out of options, I repeated. He nodded quickly. Debt. Credit cards. A loan I should not have taken. The interest is killing me. I thought I could fix it before you ever knew. I thought I could handle it. He said the last words like they tasted bitter. The waitress returned to take our order. I ordered eggs. Lucas ordered nothing. When she walked away, he leaned forward, lowering his voice. Madeline has my accounts. She has my passwords. She checks my phone. She knows where I go. If I spend $20, she asks why. I watched him. My son was almost 40, a grown man, and he was describing his life like a teenager asking permission to breathe. He kept talking. She said if I did not do what she needed, she would leave. She said she would tell everyone I was a failure, that I could not provide, that I was weak. That word landed hard. Weak. For men like Lucas, that is not just an insult. It is a sentence. I asked him the question that mattered. Why 200,000? He exhaled slowly. Because she thinks you have it. She thinks you are sitting on money and you are too stubborn to share. She said you owe us. She said you owe her. I felt anger rise, but I held it down. Anger would make me sloppy. And the paperwork I asked, the signatures, the post office box. Lucas's face turned pale. He looked at me like he had hoped I would never connect the pieces. Dad, he said, I did sign things. Not everything. Not like she wanted. But some. She told me it was just account maintenance. She said you would not mind. She said you would not understand, and it would only stress you out. He swallowed again. I lied to you. I did it. I did it because I thought I could keep everyone calm and then fix it later. That was the truth. Not clean, not heroic, but real. I sat back in the booth and looked at him. I did not recognize the man he had become, and that hurt more than any financial number Rebecca had shown me. Lucas wiped his palms on his jeans. His voice dropped to a whisper. Dad, I have something. He reached into his jacket and pulled out his phone. He hesitated, then slid it across the table to me like it was contraband. I did not touch it right away. What is it? I asked. Evidence, he said. Emails, texts, recordings. She made me keep track. She said it was proof we were doing the right thing. I started saving it for a different reason, in case I ever needed to get out. My fingers closed around the phone. It felt warm, like it had been held too tightly. Lucas's eyes were fixed on mine now. His voice cracked. I am not innocent. I know that. But I am not the one who started this. And I do not know how to stop her without losing everything. The waitress returned with my plate. The smell of eggs and toast filled the booth like a reminder that the world kept moving, no matter what we were living through. Lucas watched me like he was waiting for a verdict. I looked at my son. Then I looked at the phone in my hand. Then I looked back at him. There are moments when being a father feels simple. You protect. You provide. You forgive. This was not one of those moments. If I pulled Lucas out, I might be putting myself deeper in. If I protected myself first, I might lose him for good. I set the phone down beside my coffee and took a slow breath. I still did not know which choice would cost me more. The cost of a choice is not always loud. Sometimes it is quiet, like a plate set down too hard on a table, like a door that closes a little too carefully. After the diner, I drove home with Lucas, phone on the passenger seat, face down like it could burn through the upholstery. I did not open it while he sat across from me. I did not scroll in front of him like I was collecting evidence against my own son. I waited until I was alone, then I sat at my kitchen table and turned the screen over. There were messages, lots of them, threads that went back months. Madeline's voice was consistent across every one. Direct, controlling, always framing things as necessary, always making Lucas feel like he had one option. The emails were worse. Not dramatic, not messy, just efficient. Lists, instructions, dates, lines about what to say if I asked questions, lines about what documents would be needed. A few audio clips Lucas had saved were short but clear. Her whisper, the same tone I heard at 2:07. I called Detective Cole the next morning. He listened in silence while I summarized what Lucas had given me. When I finished, he said he wanted copies. He also said something else that felt like a weight being placed carefully into my hands. We need to move in a way that holds up. We need her to believe she is still in control. I asked him how. He did not answer right away. Then he said, "The safest way is to let her walk into her own story." That was when the dinner idea became more than a thought. It became a plan. It came from Lucas, not from me. He texted later that day and said Madeline wanted to smooth things over. She thought the call had rattled me. She wanted a family dinner, said it would clear the air. I stared at the message and felt that familiar pull. The part of me that wanted peace. The part of me that wanted my son back. The part that still believed we could sit at a table and fix what had been broken. Then I remembered the signature that looked like mine. The line of credit. The post office box. The word guardianship. I remembered how easily peace can be used as a disguise. I told Lucas yes. We set it for Friday night at their house in Frisco. A neat 2-story place in a neighborhood full of new fences and new cars, the kind of neighborhood built for people who want to look stable. I arrived a few minutes early, parking on the street instead of the driveway. I kept my phone in my pocket and my hands empty. No envelope, no folder, no papers. I wanted to look like an old man coming to dinner, nothing more. Madeline opened the door before I could knock. She smiled like she had been practicing it. "Daniel," she said warmly, as if the last week had been a misunderstanding. "Come in." The house smelled like garlic and butter. Something simmering. Something designed to feel like home. Lucas stood behind her in the hallway. His face was tight, but he nodded. We sat at the dining table, the kind with a polished surface that reflects light and makes everything look cleaner than it is. Madeline moved with confidence, pouring wine into a glass for herself, offering me water like she was doing me a favor. Lucas barely spoke. Madeline started the conversation like she was conducting a meeting. She asked how I was feeling. She said the other night had been scary for everyone. She said she understood why I might have hesitated. She said families go through stress, and it is important not to let it create permanent damage. Everything sounded reasonable. That was the point. I listened. I nodded. I kept my voice calm and my words few. I did not accuse. I did not defend myself. I watched her the way you watch a person who believes they have already won. Lucas kept his eyes on his plate. Madeline spoke about responsibilities, about how hard things had been, about how she and Lucas were trying to build a life and sometimes they needed support. She did not ask directly for money, not yet. She set the table for it piece by piece like she was laying out silverware. Then she leaned back and smiled again. "I think we can move past this," she said. We just need to be on the same page. Same page. Paper language. My stomach tightened, but my face stayed neutral. That was when the doorbell rang. Madeline froze for the smallest moment. Not enough for someone who did not know her to notice. Enough for me. She recovered quickly. Probably neighbors, she said. Maybe a package. Lucas did not move. He looked down. His hands were clenched in his lap. Madeline stood and walked to the door with the same confident stride she had used all night. She opened it. Detective Aaron Cole stood on the porch. Beside him was a man I had not met in person, but I recognized from Cole description. Nathan Brooks, the insurance investigator. They were not aggressive. They were not loud. They were dressed like men who had done this before and did not need theatrics. Madeline's smile flickered. "Can I help you?" she asked. Detective Cole spoke calmly. "Madeline Whitaker." She straightened her shoulders. "Yes." Cole held up a badge. "Mom, we need to speak with you." Madeline tried to laugh. "About what?" Cole stepped inside just enough to be heard. "About a pattern of fraudulent claims and attempted financial exploitation. We have documentation. We also have recordings." The word recordings hit the room like a sudden, cold draft. Madeline's eyes snapped toward Lucas. His face went blank. He did not defend her. He did not speak. Madeline turned toward me then like she could will me back into the role she had assigned. "Daniel," she said. "What is this?" I kept my voice low. "It is the truth." Nathan Brooks stepped forward and placed a folder on the edge of the table. He opened it and slid out printed pages. Emails, claim forms, notes with dates, screenshots of messages, a clear sequence of attempted transfers, the line of credit, the same post office box in Frisco. Madeline reached for the papers, but Detective Cole held his hand up. "Please do not touch." Her breathing changed, quick and shallow. The control began to slip. "This is ridiculous," she said. "This is a misunderstanding." Detective Cole did not argue. He simply spoke the next line, steady and final. "Ma'am, you are being detained pending further investigation. Please stand up and place your hands behind your back." Madeline stared at him, then at Lucas, then at me. For the first time since I had known her, she looked small. Not because she was powerless, but because her power depended on everyone else believing she was untouchable. She turned toward Lucas, her voice sharp now. "You did this." Lucas did not answer. Madeline tried to step back, but Cole moved smoothly, taking her wrist, turning her hands behind her. The cuffs clicked. The sound was quiet, almost polite, and that made it worse. Madeline's shoulders shook. Her face twisted with anger, then with fear, then with something close to disbelief. She looked at me again, and her voice dropped. "You are going to let them do this." I did not raise my voice. I did not gloat. I felt no satisfaction. Only a heavy sadness, like watching a storm finally hit the house you have been warned about for years. I said, "I am not letting anything happen." "You did." Detective Cole guided her toward the door. Nathan Brooks stayed behind a moment, collecting the papers back into the folder. He nodded at me, a small acknowledgement that felt more like closure than victory. Lucas sat motionless at the table, staring at the space where Madeline had been. When the front door closed, the house seemed to exhale as if it had been holding her breath the whole time. I remained seated. The room was quiet. The food was still warm. The table setting still looked perfect, but the lie was gone. I looked at my son. He did not look at me yet. He was still trying to understand what he had done and what it would cost him. I realized then that winning was not about seeing someone in handcuffs. It was about the simpler thing. I was no longer the target. And for the first time in days, I could breathe without feeling the trap tightening. I stayed seated a little longer than made sense. The house was quiet except for the hum of the refrigerator and the faint clink of a utensil settling on a plate. Lucas still had not lifted his eyes. The air felt lighter without Madeline in it, but it was not relief. It was aftermath. When I finally stood, my knees complained the way they do these days, like a reminder that time never stops just because a man is in trouble. Lucas flinched at the sound of the chair moving. "Dad," he said, his voice small. I looked at him. I could have said a lot. I could have asked why. I could have demanded explanations that would not change what had already happened. Instead, I said, "Get up. Come with me." He blinked. "Where?" "Home," I said. "For tonight." He nodded once the way a boy nods when he knows he is in trouble but also knows he is not being abandoned. He grabbed his keys and followed me out. The drive back to Plano was quiet. Streetlights passed like steady beats. Lucas kept his hands tight on his thighs. I kept both hands on the wheel, eyes forward, thinking about how close I came to losing my footing, not because of money, but because of trust. The next few weeks moved fast in slow motion. Detective Cole did not call often, but when he did, his updates were careful, formal. He said what he could and left the rest to the process. Nathan Brooks reached out once, asked me to sign a statement, then thanked me in a way that sounded more like respect than gratitude. Samuel Trent met with me twice. We did not sit around discussing feelings. We discussed protection. We updated my will. We reviewed beneficiaries. We corrected addresses. We removed access that never should have been granted. We froze credit lines I had not opened and filed the reports that needed to be filed. We created a power of attorney that reflected what I wanted, not what someone else could twist into control. We made it clear that no emergency petition would be granted without a fight and without proof. It was paperwork, but it did not feel like paperwork. It felt like reclaiming my name. Lucas stayed in my guest room for a while, not because he wanted to, because I insisted. I needed him close, not to punish him, but to see him clearly, to understand what had happened and what was still inside him. One night he stood in the hallway outside my kitchen and said he was sorry. The words sounded worn, like he had practiced them until they lost their edges. I did not tell him it was fine. It was not. I told him the truth. I said I love you. But love does not erase consequences. He stared at the floor. I know. I asked him if he understood what he had almost helped her do. He nodded. His voice broke when he answered. She wanted to make it look like you could not manage your own life. That sentence landed in the room like a weight. I told him a man can survive losing money. What is harder to survive is being treated like your choices do not matter. Lucas looked up then. For the first time in weeks, his eyes did not dodge mine. He said, "What do I do now?" That was the real question. Not about the case, not about Madeline, about the man he had become. I told him, you start with truth. You tell it to yourself first. Then you live in a way that makes it harder to lie again. He nodded. He did not ask for forgiveness. He did not deserve it yet. But he listened, and for a son, listening is sometimes the first step back. Spring came quietly. The trees in my neighborhood filled back in. The air warmed. The world returned to its routines as if nothing had happened. That is what the world does. It moves on. It forgets. It leaves you to carry the parts it cannot see. One Saturday morning, I drove out to the cemetery where Margaret is buried. I had not been in a while. Not because I forgot her, because grief has a way of making you avoid the places that ask you to feel it all at once. The grass was trimmed. The headstones stood in orderly rows. The wind moved through the trees with a soft sound that reminded me of the nights she used to breathe beside me. I walked to her stone and stood there with my hands in my pockets. For a long time I did not speak. I did not know what words could possibly fit. Then I told her what happened. Not like a confession, like a report. Calm, clear, the way I used to tell her about my day when she was too tired to ask questions, but still wanted to know I was safe. I told her about the call at 2 a.m, about the whisper, about the bank, about the papers, about how close I came to letting fear and love make decisions for me. I told her about Lucas. I did not paint him as a villain. I did not excuse him either. I told her the truth, that he had been weak, that he had been afraid, that he had been wrong. Then I told her I did not throw him away, because being a father is not about pretending your child is perfect. It is about holding him accountable without turning him into a stranger. Standing there, I realized something I had not understood when I was younger. Dignity is not something you inherit. It is not something you are granted because you worked hard or lived long. It is something you choose to protect, even when protecting it costs you comfort. I looked down at Margaret's name carved into stone. I imagined her eyes on me, not judging, not praising, just steady. When I walked back to my truck, the sun was low enough to cast long shadows across the gravel path. I felt tired, but it was a clean kind of tired, the kind a man feels when he has done what needed doing. Before I drove away, I sat with my hands on the steering wheel and thought about the men who might be listening to this. Men like me. Men who think their job is to say yes, to fix, to pay, to carry everything quietly so the people they love do not have to feel the weight. Sometimes that instinct saves your family. Sometimes it becomes the doorway someone uses to take your life apart. So I will ask you what I had to ask myself. If your child called you at 2 a.m. and asked for everything you have, would you believe them immediately? Or would you stop for 1 second and protect yourself first? And if you have ever faced a moment like that, or if you worry you might someday tell me what you did, or what you wish you had done, I read more of those answers than you might think.